Case number 1, Jennifer San Marco. Our first story takes us to a quiet corner of Southern California, to a woman named Jennifer San Marco, and to one of the darkest mornings in the history of the United States Postal Service. Jennifer was born in December of 1961 in Brooklyn, New York. She went to high school there at Edward R. Murrow High School and later spent time at Brooklyn College and then Rutgers University, where she studied natural resources management. She never actually finished her degree, and if you look at her life after that point, you start to see a pattern. She never really settled anywhere, either. In the early 90s, she worked as a correctional officer at a facility in Norco, California. Then she quit, and for a stretch she worked as a hotel clerk out in New Jersey. Then she came back to California again, this time taking a job as a residential counselor at a group home in Santa Barbara. After that, she went back to being a correctional officer, this time at a state prison in Blythe, before resigning again, citing what she called a change in career goals. Then, in 1994, she got hired by the Santa Barbara Police Department as a dispatcher. She had to pass a background check and a psychological evaluation to get that job. She lasted only a few months. Finally, in August of 1997, she landed at the United States Postal Service, working the night shift as a part-time clerk at a processing facility in Goleta, just outside Santa Barbara. That same year, she bought herself a condominium in Santa Barbara. For a while, it looked like she might have found some stability. She hadn't. According to the people who worked with her, Jennifer's behavior grew stranger and stranger over the years. She made racist comments. She was openly hostile toward her Asian co-workers. She never crossed a line into direct threats, at least not ones anyone reported, but she was keeping something disturbing hidden from everyone around her, in private. She was writing down every perceived slight, every imagined offense from her co-workers, building what almost amounted to a private case file against the people she worked beside every night. In February of 2001, things came to a head. Her supervisor reported that Jennifer was expressing suicidal thoughts and behaving erratically. Police were called, and she was removed from the facility and placed on an involuntary 72-hour psychiatric hold. A few weeks later, the Postal Service ordered her to undergo a psychological evaluation and put her on unpaid leave for 3 weeks. You'd think that might have been a turning point. Instead, it seemed to push her further into a spiral of grievance and paranoia. Throughout 2002, she began writing letters, not to friends, not to family, but to government officials. She wrote to a high-ranking official at the FBI's Los Angeles office. She wrote to California's Attorney General. In these letters, she accused the Postal Service, the local police, and the federal government itself of harassing and discriminating against her. She claimed her workplace was run under what she described as a racist and sexist system designed to target her specifically. She even claimed that the city of Santa Barbara, which she associated with German and Dutch culture, was conspiring against her because she was Italian-American. By 2003, her behavior at work had become impossible to ignore. In June of that year, she was escorted out of the building in handcuffs after an incident where she ended up underneath a mail sorting machine, and officials were worried she might hurt herself. She was allowed back to work eventually, but she was removed again not long after due to more complaint about her behavior and her racist remarks. This time, she was placed on medical leave and given early retirement on the grounds of mental disability. In 2004, Jennifer tried to start over. She attempted to drive across the entire country to move in with relatives on the East Coast. She never made it. Her car broke down in a tiny town called Milan, New Mexico, and she ended up settling in the nearby town of Grants instead. If her co-workers thought she was strange, the people of Grants, New Mexico were about to learn just how strange she could be. She was seen talking to an imaginary friend. She would order food at restaurants and then leave before it even arrived. She developed an obsession with a local municipal employee named Sonia Salazar after being denied a license to start a cat food business. She would come into the office just to stare at Salazar, to the point where other staff members would hide when they saw her coming. She'd eventually storm off, muttering to herself, gesturing at the air, before getting in her car and driving back and forth in front of the building. At one point, she accused Salazar of an affair that had never happened. On another occasion, She was found naked at a local gas station. When police arrived, she was dressed again, and they let her go with only a warning. In November 2005, just months before the shooting, a mental health clinic manager named Darlene Hayes spotted Jennifer alone in a post office parking lot, kneeling beside her car, talking to herself, claiming she was praying with her brother and sister, who weren't there. Hayes says she called the police right then and there, asking for an emergency mental health check. According to Hayes, the department later said they had no record of that call ever coming in. Despite everything, in all her time in New Mexico, Jennifer San Marco was never arrested. She was never committed for treatment. Around the same time, she had also been trying to launch her own publication. She called it the Racist Press. She'd already written 5 volumes of it by the time she applied for a business license in July of 2004. In her own words, the purpose of her publication was to expose what she believed were government-sanctioned murders happening in colleges and offices across America. Investigators who later studied her writings described them as deeply paranoid, tying together a supposed government conspiracy, the Ku Klux Klan. Half remembered childhood memories from watching the Rocky Horror Picture Show and imagined encounters with figures like serial killer David Berkowitz and former President Richard Nixon. She believed Nixon had secretly worked with the Klan. She claimed to have uncovered all of this while working at the postal facility, even as she used racist language of her own to describe black people and Jewish people. She wrote that many of her co-workers, people from places like India, the Philippines, Thailand, Mexico, and Korea, were actually secret Nazi operatives. Her application for a publishing license was denied. In November 2005, just 2 months before the shooting, she even tried placing a classified ad in the Los Angeles Times, offering to mail her publication out for $4. The ad never ran, because she never followed through on a request to provide a sample copy. Then came January 30th, 2006. That morning, Jennifer flew from New Mexico into Los Angeles. From there, she made a 2-hour drive up to Santa Barbara. Her first stop was her old apartment complex, the same one where she used to live. She climbed a fence and broke into the home of a woman named Beverly Graham, her former neighbor, a 54-year-old woman with whom she'd had a long-running feud over noise complaints. Jennifer got in through an unlocked sliding glass door, and she shot Beverly Graham twice in the head, killing her. Neighbors would later place the time of that killing somewhere between 7 and 8 in the evening. From there, Jennifer drove 5 miles down the highway to the Goleta Postal Facility, the place she used to work. She got through the gate by tailgating another vehicle. Once inside the lot, she approached an employee, pulled a gun, and took their identification badge at gunpoint, which she then used to access a secure staff entrance. She told the employee to leave. They weren't physically harmed. At 9 o'clock that night, in the parking lot outside the building, she shot and killed 2 more people, Malika Pineda and Zay Fairchild, each with a single shot to the head. Just outside the entrance, she killed a 3rd victim, Nicola Grant, with 2 shots. Because most employees inside were wearing ear protection, and because the building itself was loud with machinery, almost nobody heard the gunfire happening right outside. There were around 80 employees inside the facility at that moment, completely unaware of what was unfolding. She went inside. She shot a supervisor named Charlotte Colton in the head. A co-worker managed to drag Colton into another room. Colton would survive for 2 more days before passing away in the hospital. In another part of the building, Jennifer pointed her gun at 2 employees at point-blank range, but for reasons no one will ever fully understand, she chose not to pull the trigger. Then she made her way to her old workstation, where she encountered a woman named Guadalupe Swartz. Swartz saw her coming and tried to run. Jennifer fired 4 shots and killed her anyway. Nearby, a man named Dexter Shannon, a Vietnam War veteran and grandfather, never even heard the gunfire because he was wearing headphones while he worked. He was shot at point-blank range and killed instantly. Then Jennifer San Marco turned the gun on herself. From the moment she entered the building to the moment she took her own life, less than 2 minutes had passed. More than 100 officers responded, from the Sheriff's Department, the California Highway Patrol, and local police. They evacuated the remaining employees, moving most of them to a nearby fire station, while a SWAT team cleared the building room by room. In total, including Beverly Graham, 7 people lost their lives that day, 6 women and 1 man. All 6 of the victims killed inside the postal facility came from minority backgrounds. Nicola Grant, Malika Pineda, and Dexter Shannon were black. Guadalupe Swartz was Hispanic. Charlotte Colton was Filipino. Zay Fairchild was Hmong Laotian. These were people who had given the Postal Service anywhere from 10 to 36 years of their working lives. Investigators who searched Jennifer's home in New Mexico found boxes filled with writings that revealed just how deep her delusions ran. She genuinely believed she was a target of a conspiracy centered on that postal facility. A team of psychologists who studied the case afterward concluded she likely suffered from schizophrenia, and that in her mind, she believed she had no choice but to eliminate the people she saw as responsible for ruining her life. Her own brother later told investigators that he tried to warn police about her, that she was fixated on her old workplace, a place she described only as evil. In the aftermath, the community came together the way communities do. Funerals were held across Santa Barbara and San Diego counties over the following 2 weeks. More than 1,200 people attended Charlotte Colton's service alone. The postal facility shut down for 4 days, and roughly 300,000 pieces of mail were delayed as a result. A memorial fund was opened for the victims' families, and each family eventually received life insurance payouts along with a year's salary under an accidental death policy. About 2 weeks after the shooting, all 6 postal worker victims were posthumously honored with the Presidential Medal of Freedom in a ceremony at UC Santa Barbara. A year later, a marble plaque was installed at the facility's entrance, and 6 olive trees were planted, 1 for each life lost. And in a strange twist that had nothing to do with the shooting itself, it later came out that Beverly Graham's own boyfriend had forged a will, claiming her entire estate for himself. He was eventually convicted of multiple felonies and sentenced to prison, along with 3 accomplices who had helped fake the signatures on that document. It was a bizarre postscript to an already devastating story, a reminder that even in grief, some people find ways to exploit the dead. Case number 2, Amy Bishop. Our second case takes us into a university science department and into the story of a woman with a doctorate from Harvard and a past far darker than anyone around her realized. Her name was Amy Bishop, and she worked as a neuroscientist at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. On a Friday in February of 2010, after being told she had been denied tenure, Amy opened fire during a faculty meeting. Amy had earned her Ph.D. at Harvard, and she'd arrived in Alabama back in 2003. By all accounts, her academic credentials were solid. She even held an active research grant from the National Institutes of Health, studying how nitric oxide affects motor neurons. On paper, she was exactly the kind of scientist a university wants to keep around. But being denied tenure changes everything for an academic. It essentially means your career at that institution is over. And on that particular Friday, during what should have been just another routine faculty meeting, Amy pulled out a gun and began shooting her own colleagues. She killed her department chair, a man named Gopi Padula. She killed a plant pathologist named Maria Ragland Davis. She killed a cell biologist named Adrielle Johnson. There were roughly a dozen faculty members in that room when it happened. According to survivors, some of them dropped to the floor and crawled under the table. At some point, several of them grabbed Amy's legs and physically forced her out of the room, and her gun reportedly jammed in the chaos, which likely prevented the death toll from climbing even higher. The people she killed were remembered for who they were outside of that meeting room, too. Maria Davis had once cared for chickens that hatched in the classroom embryology lab she taught, chickens that were eventually adopted out to homes and a petting zoo. Gopi Padula had spent 20 years mentoring undergraduate and graduate students. These were people who had built entire careers around helping others learn. Once Amy was arrested and charged with capital murder and attempted murder, a charge that made her eligible for the death penalty in Alabama. Journalists and investigators started digging into her past, and what they found was staggering. It turned out that this wasn't the first time Amy Bishop had been connected to a violent death. Back in 1986, when she was just 20 years old, she shot and killed her own 18-year-old brother at their home in Braintree, Massachusetts. At the time, police investigated and ultimately ruled the death accidental. She was released without charges. Decades later, Once the university shooting made headlines, the current chief of the Braintree Police Department, a man named Paul Frazier, released a public statement saying that the original decision to release her all those years ago had never sat well with the officers involved. The district attorney at the time, who would have handled that original 1986 case, had since become a member of Congress. He didn't comment on the resurfacing case, though his chief of staff acknowledged that police at the time had suggested no further investigation was needed. Interestingly, a political opponent gearing up to challenge that same congressman for his seat began using the case as a political talking point. And there was more. Investigators also discovered that Amy had once been interviewed years earlier in connection with an unsolved case, a pipe bomb that had been mailed to a Harvard neurologist at Boston's Children's Hospital back in 1993. During the years she was pursuing her doctorate there. That case had never been solved, and to this day the connection remains just that, a piece of her past that investigators looked into but never fully closed the book on. The Huntsville shooting reignited a national conversation about the tenure process itself, about whether a professor's collegiality and interpersonal behavior should factor into these decisions the way research output does, and about whether there had been any warning signs before that faculty meeting turned deadly. One of her colleagues in the psychology department, who was going up for tenure at the same time as Amy, said afterward that he never sensed anything that suggested she was capable of this. Sometimes the most unsettling part of a story like this isn't the violence itself. It's how long a person's darkest chapter can stay buried, hidden behind degrees, grants, and a professional title, until one bad day tears it all back open. Case number 3, Tyrese Devon Haspel. Our next case is one that reads less like a workplace dispute and more like something out of a crime thriller, complete with embezzlement, a decapitation, and a trial that shocked all of New York City. The victim in this story was a man named Fahim Saleh. He was 33 years old, a successful tech entrepreneur, the co-founder and CEO of a Nigerian motorcycle ride-hailing company called Gokada. Fahim was born in Saudi Arabia to Bangladeshi parents, grew up in upstate New York, and eventually earned a computer science degree from Bentley University in Massachusetts. He had built a reputation in the tech world as someone who genuinely supported young entrepreneurs just starting out. One of the people he mentored and employed was a young man named Tyrese Haspel, who became Fahim's executive assistant back in May of 2018. Tyrese's responsibilities included managing Fahim's personal finances, which meant he had direct access to his boss's financial records. That access became a temptation. By that fall, Tyrese had already begun stealing from Fahim's companies, using 2 separate schemes. He created several financial accounts, including one through PayPal, and funneled stolen funds into them, while fabricating statements and mimicking legitimate transactions to keep the theft hidden. Tyrese actually resigned from his position in May of 2019, but he didn't stop stealing. He kept the schemes running even after he was gone. In January of 2020, one of the fraudulent transactions was finally traced back to him. Fahim confronted his former assistant directly, accusing him of stealing $35,000, and instead of going straight to police, he offered Tyrese a way out. He proposed a settlement, allowing Tyrese to pay the money back over time rather than face criminal charges. Tyrese agreed, but here's the twist. He used more stolen money, pulled from that same PayPal scheme, to make the repayments. By the time it was all uncovered, the total amount he had embezzled had ballooned to nearly $400,000. Facing the terrifying possibility that Fahim would eventually discover the full scope of what he'd done and testify against him, Tyrese made a decision that would change everything. He decided to kill him. On July 13th, 2020, Tyrese followed Fahim into his own condo on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. He used a taser on him, then stabbed him multiple times. Fahim died in his own home. The next day, Tyrese returned to the apartment, not to check on anything, but to dismember the body and try to clean up the crime scene, an act of almost unimaginable coldness following the murder itself. While he was in the middle of that grim task, he briefly stepped out. During that window, Fahim's cousin arrived to check on him, walked in, and discovered his body, with the head and limbs already severed. When Tyrese returned and saw police officers already outside the building, he chose not to go back in. 4 days later, on July 17th, police tracked him down and arrested him in Manhattan. The case went to trial, and prosecutors laid out the entire timeline for the jury. The embezzlement, the confrontation, the murder, and the attempted cover-up. In the end, the jury found Tyrese Haspel guilty of first-degree murder, along with multiple counts of grand larceny, burglary, and other related charges. Manhattan's district attorney spoke afterward about how Fahim had come from a tightly knit immigrant family and had chased his passions all the way to becoming a successful entrepreneur, and expressed hope that the guilty verdict might offer some small comfort to the people who loved him. Tyrese Haspel is scheduled to be sentenced later this year. What makes this case so unsettling isn't just the violence of it, it's the sheer premeditation. This wasn't a moment of rage in a meeting room. This was a young man who was mentored, trusted, and given real financial responsibility, choosing over months to keep stealing, and ultimately choosing murder rather than simply facing the consequences of what he'd done. Case number 4, Andrew Engeldinger. Our fourth story unfolds in Minneapolis, Minnesota, inside a sign-making business called Accent Signage Systems on an ordinary September afternoon that would become the deadliest workplace shooting in the state's history. The company sat in the Bryn Mawr neighborhood, split by Interstate 394, a small, unremarkable business making signs for a living. One of its employees was a 36-year-old man named Andrew John Engeldinger, who had lived in Minneapolis for 12 years, grown up in nearby Richfield, and graduated from the Academy of Holy Angels. According to people who knew him, Andrew was a loner. Neighbors said he almost never spoke to anyone. A former co-worker described him as someone who didn't eat lunch or take breaks with the rest of the staff. His own family later said he suffered from some kind of mental illness, one he resisted getting treated for, and that over time he had become estranged from them. On September 27, 2012, Andrew was called into the office of the company's operations director, a man named John Suter. Before heading up there, Andrew first walked out to his car, apparently to retrieve a Glock 19 handgun he had stashed inside. Once he was in Suter's office and informed that he was being let go, Andrew's response was almost eerily calm. He simply said, "Oh, really?" and pulled the gun from his holster. A struggle broke out between Andrew, Suter, and another manager named Rami Cooks. In that chaos, Suter was severely wounded and Cooks was fatally shot. But Andrew wasn't finished. He left that office and, right next door, shot and killed the company's founder, Reuven Ramim, who happened to be stepping out of his own office at that exact moment. From there, Andrew moved into a sign display area, where he shot and killed an employee named Jacob Bennick. He continued on to the loading dock, where he killed a second employee, Ronald Edberg. Then, almost incomprehensibly, he shot and killed a UPS driver named Keith Basinski, who was simply sitting in his delivery truck, making a routine stop. Finally, Andrew made his way onto the production floor, where he fatally wounded a production manager named Eric Rivers, and grazed yet another employee before it was over. The first frantic calls to 911 came at around 4:35 in the afternoon. Officers arrived within minutes and managed to help evacuate some employees, even as the situation was still unfolding. By the time it ended, 4 people were dead at the scene, with a 5th victim dying the following day. 2 more were hospitalized in critical condition, and one of those, Eric Rivers, would ultimately be taken off life support and pass away nearly 2 weeks later, on October 10th. Andrew Engeldinger died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, found in a warehouse in the basement of the very building where he'd just taken so many lives. Investigators later determined that he had fired at least 46 rounds during the attack. When they searched his home afterward, they found packaging for 10,000 rounds of ammunition, suggesting he had been heavily armed for some time and had clearly practiced extensively with his weapon. In total, 6 people lost their lives: Reuven Ramim, the company's founder, at 61 years old; Keith Basinski, the UPS driver, at 50; Rami Cooks, at 62; Ronald Edberg, at 58; Jacob Bennick, at 34; and Eric Rivers, at 42. In the aftermath, Minnesota's governor at the time, Mark Dayton, called the shooting senseless and said there was no place for that kind of violence anywhere in the state. Minneapolis's mayor, along with a local congressman, had actually visited the Accent Signage offices not long before tragedy occurred, and the mayor later expressed how deeply sorry he was for what had happened there, calling it nothing short of a horrible tragedy. Case number 5, Gary Montez Martin. Our fifth case brings us to Aurora, Illinois, and to the Henry Pratt Company, a manufacturing plant where a termination meeting turned into one of the deadliest workplace shootings the state had ever seen. The shooter's name was Gary Montez Martin, 45 years old at the time, a former employee at the plant. Relatives told reporters afterward that he'd been let go from his position roughly 2 weeks before the shooting. Other accounts suggested the actual termination meeting took place on the very day of the shooting itself, and that the violence began right there in that meeting. Gary had been born and raised in Holly Springs, Mississippi. Back in 1995, while still living there, he was convicted of felony aggravated assault and served 2.5 years in prison for it. That conviction would matter a great deal later on. Once he moved to Illinois, he racked up several more arrests with the Aurora Police Department, including incidents involving domestic violence and violating a restraining order, along with another arrest in a nearby town for disorderly conduct and property damage. Under Illinois law, that earlier felony conviction should have made it illegal for him to legally possess a firearm, and yet in 2014 he applied for and was somehow issued a firearm owner's identification card, known as a FOID card, by the Illinois State Police. That same month, using that card, he legally purchased a gun from a licensed dealer in Aurora, the very gun investigators believe he used in the shooting. Later that same month, he went a step further and applied for a concealed carry license. That application required a fingerprint-based background check, and it was during that process that his old felony conviction was finally discovered. The Illinois State Police denied his concealed carry request, canceled his FOID card, and sent him a written notice demanding he turn in the firearm he had purchased. He never did. Nobody ever followed up to confiscate that weapon. And years later, on February 15, 2019, Gary Martin brought that same gun to the Henry Pratt plant. Witnesses described him carrying a handgun fitted with a green laser sight. The first 911 calls came in around 1:24 in the afternoon, and officers arrived within 4 minutes. What followed was a massive multi-agency response, with agents from the FBI, the ATF, and the U.S. Marshal Service all joining local police at the scene. Gary exchanged gunfire with responding officers for roughly 90 minutes before he was ultimately shot and killed. Officers struck him 6 times in total, including a final shot to the middle of his forehead. By the time it was over, 5 people besides Gary himself had been killed. All 5 were male employees at the plant. Clayton Parks, the human resources manager, was 32. Josh Pinkard, the plant manager, was 37. Russell Bayer, a mold operator, was 46. Vicente Juarez, who worked in the stockroom and operated a forklift, was 54. And Trevor Weiner, only 21 years old, a student at Northern Illinois University, was on his very first day as a human resources intern when he was killed. A 6th employee was also shot and survived, along with 6 police officers who were injured in the exchange of gunfire, ranging in age from 23 to 59. None of their injuries proved to be life-threatening. When police searched Gary's home right after the shooting, they initially found nothing suggesting he had planned the attack in advance. But as the investigation continued, a different picture emerged. By May of that year, authorities determined that Gary had, in fact, entered the workplace already intending to open fire. Co-workers told police that before he was fired, he had made chilling threats, saying that if he lost his job, he was going to kill, quote, every motherfucker in here, and that he was going to blow police up. According to the employee who heard those threats, he never reported them, because Gary apparently made comments like that on a fairly regular basis, and nobody took them seriously. In the aftermath, Senators Tammy Duckworth and Dick Durbin publicly thanked law enforcement for their response, as did the governor of Illinois and, at the time, President Donald Trump, who also offered his condolences to the victims and their families. Aurora's mayor, Richard Irvin, spoke about how tragic it was that mass shootings like this had become so common in the country, calling the shooter cold and heartless for believing he had any right to take innocent lives, while insisting that society could not simply allow this kind of violence to become the new normal. Case number 6, Jing Hua Wu. Our 6th story takes us into the heart of Silicon Valley, where a test engineer's termination from a semiconductor company ended in a triple homicide. His name was Jing Hua Wu, and he worked as a test engineer at a company called Seaport, based in Santa Clara, California. On November 14, 2008, Wu was fired from his position there. Rather than simply leaving, he went home, retrieved a 9mm handgun, and returned to the company's headquarters that very same day, requesting a meeting with his superiors. During that meeting, Wu opened fire, killing 3 of the company's top executives. He shot and killed Sid Agarwal, the company's 56-year-old chief executive officer. He killed Brian Pugh, the 47-year-old vice president of operations. And he killed Marilyn Lewis, the 67-year-old human resources manager. After shooting, Wu fled the scene in a rented SUV. He was caught by police the following morning in Mountain View, not far from where the shooting had taken place. The case took years to reach trial. When it finally did, in March of 2013, a jury in Santa Clara County found Wu guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with enhancement for the use of a firearm during the crime. His defense had entered an insanity plea, arguing that Wu suffered from severe mental illness and had experienced what amounted to a psychological break brought on by financial pressure and the devastating loss of his job. The jury ultimately rejected that defense. In August of 2013, Wu was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, along with an additional 75 consecutive years tied to the firearm enhancements attached to each killing. What stands out about this case is how quickly it escalated. There was no long buildup of documented threats, no years of erratic behavior on public record the way we saw in some of our earlier cases. Just a firing, and then, that same day, a return with a weapon and a meeting that ended in 3 deaths. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the warning signs simply aren't visible until it's already too late. Case number 7, Gabriel Dit Wilson. Our 7th case takes us to a stop-and-shop grocery store in West Hempstead, New York, where an employee who wasn't even scheduled to work that day walked in with a semi-automatic weapon. His name was Gabriel Wilson. According to the Nassau County District Attorney, Gabriel intended to cause death and destruction that day, methodically moving from office to office on the store's 2nd floor, targeting his own co-workers without hesitation. On April 20th, 2021, at around 11:19 in the morning, Gabriel entered the Stop and Shop located on Cherry Valley Avenue. He wasn't scheduled to be there. He made his way up to the 2nd floor, where the store's management offices were located. He walked into the store manager's office first and shot 1 victim in the face and twice in the chest. Then he shot a female manager, hitting her in the shoulder, with a bullet passing through and exiting her back. From there, he entered a 2nd office and fired multiple rounds, striking a 49-year-old employee named Ray Wishrop in the chest and leg. Wishrop was pronounced dead at the scene. Police tracked Gabriel down later that afternoon, arresting him at around 3:50 in Hempstead, with officers from both the Nassau County Police Department's Bureau of Special Operations and the local Hempstead police involved in the apprehension. The case eventually went to trial, and Nassau County's district attorney did not hold back in describing what kind of person Gabriel Wilson was. Prosecutors pointed out that throughout the entire trial, and even after his arrest, he showed no contrition and no remorse for what he had done. In the end, that lack of remorse, combined with the brutal, methodical nature of the shooting, weighed heavily. The district attorney expressed hope that whatever sentence Gabriel ultimately received might bring some measure of justice to Ray Wishrop's grieving family, friends, and former co-workers, people who were still very much mourning his loss by the time the case concluded. Case number 8, Karrie Joe Tesnney. Our 8th story takes us to Birmingham, Alabama, and to a UPS package processing warehouse in the Inglenook area, where a driver who had spent more than 2 decades with the company returned one final time. His name was Karrie Joe Tesnney, 45 years old, and for 21 years he had worked as a delivery driver for UPS. About a month before the shooting, he had been fired. He fought the decision through his union, filing an administrative appeal, but he officially lost that appeal just days before the incident, receiving his final termination papers in the mail the day before it happened. On the morning of Tuesday, September 23rd, 2014, Karrie drove his own personal vehicle straight into the rear dock area of the warehouse. He made his way toward the management offices and shot 2 supervisors. He killed Brian Callens, a 46-year-old business manager who had spent 26 years with the company, and Doug Hutchison, a 33-year-old driver supervisor. After the shooting, Karrie turned the gun on himself. He died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound before Birmingham police could even finish clearing the building. When officers found him, he was still wearing his brown UPS work uniform. In the days that followed, people close to Karrie tried to make sense of what had happened. His pastor, from North Park Baptist Church, told reporters that Karrie had been deeply troubled by severe financial problems and mounting personal stress following his termination. Court records also revealed an odd footnote to his story, a lawsuit filed by a local business against both Karrie and UPS, related to a missing $4,000 radiator shipment. A judge had actually ruled in Karrie's favor in that case, exactly 1 year to the day before the shooting took place. Whether that long-running legal dispute played any role in his eventual firing from UPS remains unclear to this day. Case number 9, Jeremy Spicer. Our 9th case unfolds across 3 separate logistics companies, all housed inside the same office complex in Burr Ridge, Illinois, where one man's termination sparked a chain of violence that moved from building to building. His name was Jeremy Jerome Spicer, a 31-year-old truck driver from Pine Bluff, Arkansas. On March 22, 2022, around 3 in the afternoon, Jeremy walked into a company called Winner's Freight, located at the Meadowbrook Office Center. He had only worked there for about 1 week and had delivered exactly 1 load for them. When a disagreement broke out over whether he'd take on another assignment, the company decided to fire him. Instead of simply accepting that, Jeremy shot and killed his supervisor, a 30-year-old man named Nikola Misavic, firing multiple times. Misavic was rushed to a nearby hospital, where he later died from his injuries. But Jeremy wasn't done. He then walked over to a second business inside that same office park, a company called Forest Transportation, where he had previously worked before Winner's Freight. There, he shot and severely wounded a 31-year-old woman working as a receptionist and accountant. She was shot multiple times, though she would ultimately survive and was listed in stable condition in intensive care. From there, Jeremy moved on to a third company inside the complex, a business called Exit Logistics, where he had worked even earlier than that. He demanded to see the owner, but when he learned the owner wasn't there, he simply left. After the third stop, Jeremy walked roughly 3/4 mile away to an entirely different business and asked to use their restroom. He stayed inside for about 20 minutes before employees, growing suspicious, asked them to leave and called the police, who by that point had already flooded the area searching for him. Officers found him sitting outside on the sidewalk. As the first responding officer approached and took cover behind his patrol car, he heard a single gunshot. When he looked over, Jeremy was already dead, having turned his .40 caliber Glock handgun on himself. In the search that followed, investigators found that Jeremy had been living out a hotel room for about a week, and inside that room, they found an empty holster. As they dug into his background, they discovered he had 1 prior conviction in Arkansas for domestic battery. Perhaps more chillingly, police in a nearby town, Schaumburg, recognized his name too. They had previously been called out to deal with a workplace dispute between Jeremy and a boss at yet another logistics company, one where he had refused to hand over keys to a company truck. No weapons or physical threats had been involved in that earlier incident, but looking back, it fit a pattern that had been building for some time. Case number 10, Apheni Badu Muhammad. Our final case for today is one of the most recent, and it unfolded not in a corporate office or an industrial warehouse, but inside a McDonald's restaurant in East Point, Michigan. On July 10, 2025, 26-year-old Apheni Badu Muhammad allegedly stabbed her manager to death. The victim's name was Jennifer Harris, 39 years old, a mother of 6 children, who had worked at that same McDonald's location for 15 years. According to investigators, Jennifer had sent Apheni home early from her shift that day after the two of them got into an argument, rather than simply going home. Police say Apheni drove to a nearby park, put on a hooded mask to hide her identity, and then drove back to the restaurant, this time armed with a large kitchen knife. She entered through the back employee entrance and stabbed Jennifer at least 13 times. The attack might have gone even further, if not for a customer who happened to be at the drive-thru window. That customer, who was legally carrying a concealed firearm, witnessed what was happening, drew his weapon, and fired a warning shot. That was enough to stop the attack. The customer then followed Apheni out to the parking lot and held her at gunpoint until police arrived. Following her arrest, police say Apheni confessed to the killing, telling investigators she had intended to kill Jennifer because she felt her manager had been bullying her. She was charged with first-degree premeditated murder, a charge that carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, along with carrying a dangerous weapon with unlawful intent, because of a prior 2022 felony conviction out of Virginia involving an incident with her boyfriend. She was also charged as a second offense habitual offender. At her arraignment, held the day after the killing in the 38th District Court in East Point, the judge set her bond at $25 million, cash or surety only. The conditions attached to that bond, if she were ever able to post it, were strict. She would be required to wear a steel cuff tether, report daily to community corrections, submit to regular drug and alcohol testing, avoid any contact with Jennifer Harris's family, and never return to that McDonald's location. In October 2025, a court-ordered competency evaluation was conducted by the Center for Forensic Psychiatry, and Apheni was deemed competent to understand the charges against her and to participate in her own defense. Her preliminary hearing in November of 2025 didn't go smoothly. Emotional tensions inside the courtroom boiled over into a physical altercation among people attending, and in one particularly startling moment, one of Jennifer Harris's daughters attempted to bring a knife into the courthouse. After that, the judge made the decision to bar the public and both families from attending the rest of preliminary hearings. As it stands, Apheni Badu Muhammad remains held at the Macomb County Jail, and her jury trial is currently scheduled to begin in September of 2026. The Macomb County prosecutor at the time spoke about just how senseless and heartbreaking this case was, describing a life taken through an act of unimaginable violence, and pointing out that Jennifer left behind 6 children who would now grow up without their mother. He questioned aloud how, for some people, the answer to a disagreement or a conflict had become picking up a weapon instead of finding a peaceful resolution, and said that kind of response should never be treated as normal or acceptable. He emphasized that his office remained committed to pursuing justice for Jennifer and her family, and that everyone's life and the lives of others carries real value, a value that this case should remind all of us never to lose sight of. That's all 10 cases for today. 10 different workplaces, 10 different lives cut short, and in some cases, many more lives lost alongside them. What strikes me, looking across all of these stories together, is how differently they all began. Some of these people showed years of documented warning signs. Others seemed to snap in what looked, from the outside, like a single unremarkable afternoon. If there's one thing worth sitting with after a video like this, it's this. Workplace violence rarely comes from nowhere, but it also isn't always predictable. And that's exactly what makes it so hard to prevent. If this video affected you the way it affected me putting it together, let me know down in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.